All right, so we're going to complete your completing the square notes and just to kind of recap here from where we've been. We talked about how if we factor a problem, that it might take us through several steps because we're going to have to use the zero product property. We're going to have to multiply things out, write it in standard form. So this point is where we've written it in standard form and then factored to use the zero product property. And this is actually a simpler problem. The genius way, so we talked about what is a simpler way, just kind of comparing. Right now we could use square root. So we take square root of the left side, square of the right side. So completing the square is kind of helping us to be able to actually utilize this genius way or this square roots way, the simpler way of solving. So again, this table, use this to help you think about this when you are completing the square. And we did this example together in class, talking about how to get something to become a perfect square. So remember that process of looking at this 14, looking at this middle term when it's written in standard form, dividing by 2, squaring it gives me that piece that I need in order to turn that into a perfect square. And this minus 49 is kind of your operation you do to balance the plus 49 that you did. So you're not actually changing anything, you're just strategically positioning some numbers in there. So we're going to do one more example here, and this will be a very short finish, but I'd like you to add to your notes that completing the square, what we're trying to do here to solve an equation, it combines the two things we've done thus far, factoring and using square roots to solve. Now, it doesn't say that we're using zero product property. It says that we're using factoring and using square roots, those two skills. So we're going to solve this equation by completing the square. A difference between this and factoring is right now this equation is equal to 0. But in fact, I actually want this equation, I'm going to solve it by completing the square. I actually want this equation not to be equal to 0. I want to move any number that's by itself, I want to move it to the other side of the equation. So any number that's not with a variable, any constant term. The reason being is, when we did the practice before, we just kind of moved the 30 off to the side. Here we're going to move it completely to the other side of the equation. Okay, so now I'm going to complete the square. So once I have just my standard form with my constant on the other side, I'm going to go ahead and complete the square. So what do I need in this blank space? Well, how am I going to decide? I'm going to divide that 12 by 2, turning that into a 6, and then I'm going to square that value, giving me 36. Make sure you write out these steps because this is the only example that we'll be doing together. So I divided by 2, gave me 6. I squared to give me 36. That's going to turn this into a perfect square. Now, the step I'm missing here is that I've got to think about how am I going to balance this out. Well, now I have two sides of an equation. Before I just had an expression, I didn't have two sides of an equation. So if I add 36 onto the left side, what can I do to balance that out? I can add 36 to the right side. Now I'm ready to factor. On the left side, x squared plus 12x plus 36 becomes x plus 6 times x plus 6. So that's x plus 6 squared. And on the right side, negative 30 plus 36 is positive 6. So now I have an equation. If you went back and looked, I have an equation that I am ready to use the square root on. I have a term squared, so I'm going to take the square root. Completing the squares basically just sets up your equation so you're ready to use a square root to solve. So I have the square and square root cancel out. I'm left with x plus 6 equals, and I'm going to leave the square root of 6. I could use a decimal, but I'm going to just leave it as the square root of 6. But you remember I have to do the positive number. I have to solve two things here. I have to solve the positive number, and I have to solve the negative number once I've taken the square root. So I'm just going to leave it written as square root of 6 instead of instead of writing anything else out as far as like the decimals. Oh, sorry. So if I subtract 6, and I subtract 6, I get that x is the square root of 6 minus 6, and I get that x is negative square root of 6 minus 6. So because that number didn't work out as a perfect square, that's okay. I'm going to write my answer though, and I'm going to use that positive and negative plus or minus. I'm going to write my answer with that square root sign still involved. It doesn't hurt anything. It doesn't make your answer any better or worse. Just we're going to leave it as the square root so that if you wanted to use a decimal, all you have to do is type it into the calculator. So that's our example for our notebook. What you're going to see on Khan Academy is this kind of setup. So just wanted to explain to you so you know what you're going to see. You're going to see problems, and you're going to be asked to write the steps where it's completed the square. So if I'm going to work through this problem, I'm going to only write a couple of things here. I'm going to add 32 to both sides, move the constant term over. Khan Academy doesn't care about me writing this in. What they care about is, okay, now I'm going to complete the square, so I'm going to divide by 2, and I'm going to square it. So that'll be plus 4. I need to balance that out on both sides. This is the step now where I factor it. Khan Academy wants to see your answer. So you're going to put positive 2 and 36. If this was a minus sign in here, you would just write negative 2. But it's not, so we won't. Then when I solve this, square root, I have x plus 2 equals 6, and I have x plus 2 equals negative 6. And then I would put my answers in those blank spaces. So 4 is one of my solutions, and negative 8 is my other solution. So you see what Khan Academy is asking you to do. So we're taking completing the square, but now we're using it strategically to solve.